But we also know that the second thing we need to do is to suck the massive amounts of carbon that we have already emitted back somewhere useful, namely the soil and biomass. That's what's known as ecosystem-based adaptation. But figuring out how to pay for it is a devilishly hard subject. And today we are joined by a number of absolutely amazing presenters and panelists. And first but not least, but from my perspective, most interesting, will be my colleague, Dr. Lalisa Duguma from World Agroforestry, who has done some sterling work on studying these issues in the Gambia. Lalisa, the floor is yours. Lalisa Duguma. Ladies and gentlemen, a slight technical hitch. Lalisa will be with us in a minute.
I'm Lalisa Duguma from CIFOR-ICRAF, a scientist working on sustainable landscapes and climate actions. Today I'll briefly talk about implementing ecosystem-based adaptation and the challenges associated with it. This talk will be largely based on the experience we have implementing large-scale ecosystem-based adaptation project in the Gambia, which is financed by the Green Climate Fund. The first and the most important point is what should be the extent of interventions that we are looking at, and what is the change that we are adapting to. This design or this thinking should be informed by data. And in Africa, as we all know, climate information or climate-related data is quite scarce, or wherever it is available, inconsistent. And this is making the design process quite challenging. And if you see most of them, they're based on global data sets which are downscaled to the local context. In this downscaling process, there is a lot of contextual realities that we are missing that could have informed the design process much better. And the second point is the institutional capacity to implement ecosystem-based adaptation or adaptation actions in general. When we talk about institutional capacity, it is about the infrastructure that is required to implement adaptation actions and the human resource that is required to take this action forward. And in many places or in many contexts, these resources are actually very scarce, and we need to invest in that from the onset. The third point, which I would briefly touch on, is the mismatch. Very often, there is a mismatch from intervention point of view and from resource point of view. Intervention mismatch is what people want because they see their environment in a given context versus what should actually be done to properly adapt to the observed changes and the likely future changes in climate context. When we talk about resource mismatch, it is about what is needed to be done versus what is available to support that action. And very often the mismatch is actually most interventions that could have helped with adaptation actions are often very scarce. This is generally understandable because we know that adaptation finance is still lagging behind when we compare it against the mitigation interventions. The fourth, is the design issues. And in these design issues, we need to look at adaptation from a system perspective, because if we don't look at it from an interconnectedness between the different elements of the landscape, we may miss out on some, thereby aggravating the trade-off resulting from even our own actions. What do I mean by that? If we are taking actions in the farmland areas and ignore the forest adjacent to the farmlands, or if we are taking action in the farmlands and ignoring the watershed at large, then our interventions impact may not be that significant because there is still a big component that is missing from the intervention design. Thus, adaptation need to be a system, need to take a systems approach when we are looking at this impact at a higher level. And this next point is measuring the impact of our interventions. As we all know, measuring adaptation impacts has been a challenge for quite some time, even though there is a growing consensus that we need to localize the process. What do we mean by localizing the process? The indicators for performance should actually be based on the local realities, not to be generalized at a country level or at a global level. There could be some that could be generalizable, but most adaptation indicators cannot actually be taken beyond the scale at which they are implemented, even though there are still some, as I said earlier. The last point is the scaling strategies. I mean, the way we see most of the adaptation actions going on, there is no clear scaling strategy to make the impact bigger than what the project can achieve. The projects, they tick the box. The government has committed to scale these interventions beyond the project level. That's how projects get approved. But there is no commitment. I mean, there is no deliberate commitment. There is no clear action plan on how that scaling should go forward. In a nutshell, these are some points that I wanted to highlight, and I hope they will be helpful. Thank you so much.
Taken out of it is that we have a number of problems, but they are problems of compatibility. We have incompatible data. We have a mismatch of resources to the needs of interventions for adaptation. We have a lag of finance on adaptation towards mitigation. And we have design issues. I'm sure that we'll be dealing with those issues when we come to our panel, but before we do that, I'm delighted to pass the floor over to Arjuna Srinidhi. Arjuna is a thematic lead for ecosystem-based adaptation at the Watershed Organization Trust, a wonderful acronym, WOTR. Arjuna works on research and implementation of climate change adaptation projects that are seeking to build resilience and do sustainable developments in dryland areas. In addition to that work, he is pursuing a PhD at Wageningen, working on climate-resilient development pathways for semi-arid regions. Arjuna, the floor is yours.
Considering the difficulty that I think some of us had in getting access to the platform, I just want to double check that you're able to hear me clearly. Yeah.
We can hear, can you hear us? Technical side, Arjuna
Yes.
is not sure he can hear us.
Are you able to hear me now, Peter?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Hey, technical side, can somebody reassure Arjuna that he can,
Yes.
we can hear him?
Sure, I can hear you. Yeah. Okay, I'll go on.
Thank you.
So great, thanks a lot, Peter, and warm greetings to everyone from India, where today is a big festival for us here. It's called Diwali, a festival of lights. And I've tried my best to find a soundproof room, but if you still hear any really loud noises from my end, rest assured that I'm safe, and it's just the Diwali fireworks. Right, so getting back to EBA, as you would understand, I mean, India is huge, both in terms of its population and geographical area. So we started our efforts on upscaling EBA in the state of Maharashtra, which is itself quite large, nearly the size of Germany. So what I will discuss today is the experience of WOTR and TMG in Maharashtra, along with challenges and opportunities that we saw, and end with some pointers on how EBA can be upscaled across the country. So why did we focus on Maharashtra to begin with? Over 80% of the state consists of rain-fed drylands that are drought-prone and poor in natural resources. The frequency of droughts have increased sevenfold in the past 50 years. There are also floods, and due to the erratic weather, adding to the vulnerability of the farmers. Over 40% of the land is degraded, and groundwater levels are falling rapidly by 1 to 2 meters every year. And over 3/4 of the farmers are smallholders with less than 2 hectares of land. So their adaptive capacities are limited as they face rising debts and distress migration. Also, the markets have pushed farmers into monocultures of cotton, sugarcane, aggravating the risk of crop failure. To sum up, this area is highly vulnerable to climate change. So against this background, we started our work by assessing opportunities and challenges for scaling EBA. Studying the government programs showed us that a number of them are specific to a certain sector, like water resources or agriculture, often operating in silos. Some of the other challenges that we encountered were standardized and rigid implementation methodologies that don't recognize locale specific issues, perceived trade-offs between ecosystem health and agriculture productivity by farmers, and the lack of financial resources and capacities of implementing agencies. We saw some opportunities too. One early insight was that considering the magnitude of challenges, upscaling has to involve mainstreaming EBA into government policies and programs while we also engage with other actors. The other significant opportunity that we saw was that watershed development is a well-accepted response to the challenges of dryland areas that also has the potential to integrate several areas of intervention. So how did we develop this roadmap for upscaling EBA? We brought together several stakeholders from different sectors, from the local to the state level, and had several rounds of multi-stakeholder consultations around the importance of EBA to build awareness and generate a buy-in. We constituted an expert committee and held several virtual thematic dialogues that covered the subjects of biodiversity, land and forests, agriculture, livestock, and water management. The purpose of these consultations were to discuss how to upscale and mainstream EBA into different programs and policies of each sector, and also to understand the collaboration that is possible between the sectors. Water's own insights in implementing and pioneering community-led watershed development was an important input in this regard. And finally, this collaborative process resulted in an evidence-based and demand-driven roadmap for upscaling EBA. There were several lessons that we learned over the past couple of years. The unanimous acceptance of the roadmap from diverse stakeholders showed us that generating a buy-in from early stages of the project was crucial. We believe what also contributed to the understanding of the value that different stakeholders saw in EBA was the value that they saw from their different perspectives. For instance, the local community realized that EBA doesn't lead to any compromises in income, and in fact can make it more resilient. Government officials began to see synergies that the EBA approach has in existing government programs related to watershed development or agricultural schemes. Senior government officials, especially those at the national level, also began to see the extent to which EBA can contribute to several global targets that India is also committed to, like the NDCs, the SDGs, LDN targets, etc. Even in terms of communicating the different benefits of EBA, having a customized outreach strategy for each stakeholder group was something that served us quite well. We believe we have initiated a fair amount of momentum around EBA in Maharashtra, but this is definitely not where our roadmap ends. Our goal is a climate resilient, prosperous, and just future for the state, and in time, the rest of the country. The way we intend to go about this is to continue working closely with the state government and all other relevant stakeholders in order to implement and follow up on the roadmap. Our continuous advocacy on EBA with the focus on both international obligations, but also national and state level priorities, such as doubling farmers' income and addressing the agrarian distress in India. And one concrete way in which we see EBA being scaled up across India is through the launch of a new collaborative on EBA. This collaborative will include civil society organizations, research institutes, thematic experts, private sector and government officials, all keen on upscaling EBA across the country. It will be called the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Resilient Incomes, or ECOBARI. the official launch for which will be soon after the COP on the 19th of November, for which we would welcome all of you. So that is how we see the roadmap going ahead and getting upscaled across the country. That was our experience from India. And please do write into us. We would be happy to share more experiences with you and also share links to the launch of the collaborative I mentioned and the roadmap that I was talking about. Thank you very much. Back to you, Peter.
Who's next? Thank you. Arjuna, what you have told us is remind us of the oldest thing in the book. If you want to achieve something at large scale, you have to walk together and talk together. You have to bring all of the stakeholders to the table, and you have to help them interact in ways that are productive, irrespective of their respective levels of power, income, wealth, or the objectives they pursue in the future. What you have done in Maharashtra is charter the roadmap that can lead to a state that is ecologically secure and that is prosperous by focusing on those incentives and focusing on stakeholder management. And that has been absolutely transformative. Now, to discuss the, sorry, who's it? Namita. Namita, who I have the pleasure of welcoming now, is the founder and managing director of auctusESG. She is a senior business leader with 30 years of diverse global experiences in climate strategy and sustainability across sectors. That means she started before most people knew that there was a climate crisis. Thank you, Namita. You've done banking, you've done technology, you've worked for FMCG companies, and you've always had that focus on sustainable climate and green finance, climate action, and climate risk management. You've launched a number of green and sustainable wholesale and retail financial products and have contributed to raising over $1 billion of capital and credit lines. Under your guidance, the first ever green bond of India was issued in 2015 and was accredited by GCF. You founded auctusESG in 2020, and auctusESG is an expert advisory body on sustainable finance and ESG, and it immediately won India's SME Leadership Champion, the UN Women 2021 Asia Pacific WEP. Namita, you were ranked as one of the leading women in business sustainability by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, and are globally recognized as Sustainability Leader of the Year by the Ethical Corporation in the UK. I am sitting here with my jaw hitting the floor, Namita. You have a seriously impressive background, and I know you're going to tell us how we can finally scale up these things and give us the recipes that we all so desperately need. Namita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here. Well, as we heard from Arjuna and the other speakers, healthier ecosystems and livelihoods are central to any economic growth. And these are increasingly being degraded by the pressures of pollution and climate change. Therefore, banks, investors, and insurers need to make better decisions. One, by assessing their impacts and dependencies on nature and materiality around climate risks. And second, by deploying capital towards ecosystem-based adaptation, given the effectiveness of such solutions. Well, adaptation finance is about going beyond business as usual and incorporating the possible effects of climate change into the design of an activity. It sounds pretty straightforward, but for financial institutions to decide which part of beyond business as usual is counted towards adaptation finance is very, very challenging. And this is because of the lack of a common unified definition of a framework across geographies, which has led to it being a very small piece of the larger climate finance pie. And we've seen the UNEP Adaptation Finance Gap report that clearly states it, right? Adaptation finance in FY 1920 saw an increase over 50% when compared to the FY 17-18 numbers. However, 90% of the tracked climate finance continues to flow towards mitigation. A recent research report showed that in, again, financial year 2020, mitigation finance reached $571 billion US, while adaptation finance failed to even touch the $50 billion mark. So this stark difference between capital flows to mitigation and adaptation demonstrates that this finance is just about trickling through the climate finance funnel. And given the intensifying climate impacts, these gaps are only widening. Hence, a drastic shift in focus towards financing adaptation strategies at speed and on priority is an imperative. When we come to ecosystem-based adaptation or EBA, it serves multiple benefits like building resilience or reducing climate risks, both that demand immediate action. However, EBA financing funnel is further narrow, and with current capital flows at just about 15 to 80 billion US dollars, it is minuscule in comparison to the global annual requirement of 536 billion US dollars. Today, climate change, a fragile ecology, and economic crisis are impacting humanity, and it is really sitting on a ticking bomb. And scaling EBA finance would help diffuse this, especially when 50% of the global GDP is said to be moderately or highly dependent on nature. But financing such projects can be very challenging, especially for the private sector, largely because EBA projects are often based on unproven concepts or technologies that make them high risk for investors. In India, for instance, the largely asset collateral driven bank lending culture makes it tough to get credit for such high risk perceived nature projects. Further, high dependencies on externalities and the variables involved. Any minor fluctuation in any one of these potentially reduces expected cash flows, and this impacts from investors coming forward. Thirdly, the issue of long gestation periods. Climate adaptation and EBA type of projects tend to have multidimensional benefits, of which are very difficult to quantify and hence monetize. So for example, preservation of wetlands can help avoid floods, but how does one translate that into measurable benefits for communities or investors? That is the question. The financial sector must not ignore the opportunities that emerge. COP26 has held nature high on its agenda. More than 30 financial institutions with AUM of over 8.7 trillion US dollars have committed to tackle agricultural commodity-driven deforestation, indicating a spike in financing nature-based solutions and sustainable livelihoods. And it also makes a business case, as investing in nature offers or is a $10 trillion opportunity in business value and estimates to create close to 400 million jobs. So I think what is important is to look at what are the innovative financing instruments that are that exist or that have been piloted and have the potential to be replicable, scalable, and sustainable. I take the example of Morocco here. The High Atlas Foundation works with farmers to plant high-quality fruit plantations towards livelihood security. The land is provided by the government, and the risk of the project is shared by public and private investors in a blended finance model. The sale of carbon credits and certified products generates the required revenues, and these are reinvested into more plantations. This way, it ensures long-term financial sustainability of the entire model, and they've taken a target to reach 1 billion trees plantation by 2030. Similarly, the Livelihoods Carbon Fund that supports restoration and conservation of natural ecosystems provides upfront financing for project implementation and maintenance over 10 to 20 years. This serves as patient capital to finance large-scale projects. The fund also is based on results in form of and gives it back in forms of carbon credits for those who bear the risk. I think such innovative mechanisms not only incentivize and enhance resilience amongst vulnerable populations, but also align with indices of countries, and that is very, very critical. Other debt financing instruments like forest bonds or forest resilient bonds exist as very impactful instruments towards EBA. Forest resilience bonds are just a variant of green bonds, and these leverage the relatively predictable cash flows generated by sustainable forestry to access capital. In innovative public-private partnership structures that are based on risk-sharing mechanisms, public agencies or state utilities can reimburse investors with principals and coupons upon completion of a project. By drawing on private investment capital, such models like the forest resilience bonds has demonstrated that it can increase the pace and the scale of restoration activities. I think these kind of low return on investment this one particularly is. However, there are investors who are pretty much attracted to these kind of financing models in order to mitigate their own risks from costly droughts or disruptions to water supply. Another emerging instrument is the environment impact bond that aims for competitive risk-adjusted returns. The issuer raises risk capital from investors on a pay-for-success model or basis. And in countries like India or similar geographies where the success of proposed interventions related to EBA are often uncertain or untested, these types of outcome-based financing instruments have proven to be a practical route to raising private capital. All in all I want to say is that private sector has an immense opportunity to engage in EBA financing, co-investments through de-risking, bundling of small projects, or with the support of supranational funds like the GCF, for example, serves as a big opportunity that is just waiting to be taken. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Namita. Innovation is the challenge of the financial sector when it comes to EBA, because you said so many of the ecosystem-based adaptation proposals we have are unproven. And that gets me back to the comments that Lalisa did at the beginning, that we're all about the difficulty of accurately monitoring and standardizing the monitoring of ecosystem-based adaptation interventions. And so perhaps there is a partnership here that can be established between the financial institutions, the project developers, and the researchers to begin to put in place protocols that give your investors the reassurance and the risk management profile that they're looking for without falling into the trap of managing to the metric. Because after all, what we want to do is to ensure that ecosystems are adapted, not to tick boxes on a list. And to discuss these issues, I have with me today an absolutely sterling panel that brings on board some of these individuals. Dr. Malanding Jaiteh from Ghana is the project manager of the large-scale ecosystem-based adaptation project in the Gambia. He was the technical advisor to the Minister of the Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resources, and spent 17 years as a geospatial scientist. Welcome, Dr. Malanding Jaiteh. Andreas is Andreas Reumann. I'll pronounce it the German way. Andreas Reumann is the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit at Interim of the Green Climate Fund. His extensive experience includes designing impact monitoring systems for large research for development projects, developing alternative evaluation methods, and prior to this, strengthening the Center for International Forestry Research, thank you, M&E capacity. He holds a BA in European Economic Studies and an MSc from the in economics from the University of Copenhagen. Andreas, welcome. Then remotely, we are going to have Serah Kiragu-Wissler, a social scientist with a lot of experience in facilitation and the management of research and development cooperation. She is a senior research associate at TMG Research, which is based in Berlin and is a sustainability think tank. She's also the country program manager for TMG's research projects in Kenya. Serah, welcome. Finally, in the room, we are going to have Nitin Pandit. Nitin is the director of the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, ATREE. And ATREE is doing something rather fantastic. It is coordinating the Alliance for Reversing Ecosystem Service Threats. And you will love the acronym. It's called ARREST. And if there is a better promise for what we are trying to do to the climate, arrest carbon buildup, arrest ecosystem degradation, arrest biodiversity loss, this is it. And what ARREST does, it has 4 major spheres of activity: restoring stream networks, moving from invasive plants to incentives, reviving open natural ecosystems, and my favorite, rejuvenating degraded agricultural lands. Nitin, welcome. I will start this panel by asking Dr. Jaiteh, with your experience in the Gambia, presumably you've worked together with Lalisa. How does one go about developing monitoring systems for ecosystem-based adaptation that capture the essential differences in the various contexts in which we operate, but are nevertheless standardized enough to form the kind of protocol that would reassure people like our friend Namita?
Well, thank you very much for that. And of course, thanks to our colleagues at ICRAF for organizing this. And of course, for also helping out since the beginning of the EBA project in the Gambia. ICRAF had a stunning team in terms of really providing technical assistance to support EBA actions in the Gambia. The project itself is pretty big in Gambian context because it's a $20 million, 6 years project. And the idea is really to help bring investments in restoring almost 12,000 hectares of degraded forest ecosystems, as well as including mangroves, as well as 3,000 hectares of degraded agricultural ecosystems. But the other component of the project, aside from the restoration project part, is really to promote the establishment of enterprises that are natural resource based. So one aspect is get the natural resource base up, at the same time promote their use, but in a very sustainable manner in terms of helping communities develop, establish businesses that are primarily to extract whatever is available in a non-destructive way. Of course, as we progress through, this is the 4th year, we have learned quite a lot, both in terms of some of the challenges, as Lalisa mentioned, in getting the restoration process up and running, as well as the upcoming challenges in maintaining some of the gains. Because landscape level, you cannot isolate things easily. And one of the biggest challenges we have is capacity at national level, both in terms of the infrastructure, in making sure that we have the necessary capacity to restore, to put in place the restoration process itself, as well as the capacity at policy level, at institutional level, in order to really make it all seamless, given that a landscape, there are many players and many users. At the same time, it is very complex, since from one community to the next, the challenges are real. As Lalisa mentioned, one intervention on one side that is designed to promote and benefit ecosystems on one way is actually bringing in more troubles for communities or other users of the ecosystems. So all of that activities really made it very challenging, but we have, we have tried to put in place some rigorous policy issues, because when the first baseline study came out and we have looked at the issues, some key things come out. The necessary seedlings and seed resources need to be in place. So the project quickly went in and invested on establishing 9 central nurseries. Capacity of 1 million seedlings per year, but even that is not enough, given the fact that much of our ecosystems are very degraded. At the same time, we have a very high, dense population and very much dependent on the use of these wood resources mainly for either land for cropping or even for fuel wood, as well as a large livestock population that's also very much users of the same resources. So no matter how quickly we plant, the need to support the demand currently that exists is very, very high. So we do recognize that. And some of the policy implications is that we have to really have a handle on what we consider to be a minimum tree cover. We've started conversations and we are really pushing the idea that no matter what, wherever you are, there is a minimum cover that we should maintain. And we believe that is one metric when it comes to really looking at how well are we doing. If we are able to agree and establish such a threshold, it will help very much in terms of see how close are we to that kind of cover. And the other part in the discussion is how do we really manage livestock, given that livestock is often heavily dependent on in terms of providing small farmers, especially women, extra income. But at the same time, livestock management is very much free range. And in fact, we have an international dimension where we have transhumans coming from the drier north of the Gambia, mainly Senegal, and as well as moving across the country. So transhumans do present serious challenges, especially to our newly established seedlings, newly established planting areas. So all of these issues really are important to understand before we set out to really look at the metrics or what type of monitoring system do we put in place in order to convince ourselves that we are moving forward, given the fact that, yes, farmers may be planting in their agricultural lands, but as soon as they are gone, and in fact 2 years later, some other transhuman population can come in and then start, destroying these things. So essentially, we are looking at a very robust way of national debate that will provide the most important either legislation or at least protocols that will be around management of livestock. We've also identified another important obstacle and challenge, and that is fires. We have serious fires, and fires are by far the most damaging across. These are issues that require national, in fact, sometimes international attention, and they do demand a lot of resources because fire management across landscapes in general is not cheap. And the project's success depends on long-term management of fires, not today's management of fires, because whatever we put in must be allowed to continue for many, many years to come. And in order to really succeed in that long term, securing that long term of the success of the project, the country and I would say almost all ecosystem-based approaches in our part of the world should have a very robust long-term fire management system, because it is definitely one of the basic, important problems. So essentially, there is also another component which Gambia has suffered. This may be primarily Gambia's issue, not many other places, and that is human capacity. We, until now, did not have a very robust natural resource management institution. And this is something that has prevented us from having the necessary capacity. Of course, we are relying on ICRAF today and their expertise, but the long term really requires that we build a very strong, broad base, but also very scientific, in order to be able to maintain some of the approaches.
Thank you, Malanding. What I noticed there is you have a landscape in which there's a desperate demand for firewood, for fodder. There is mishandling of resources, for example, by using fire or by not managing the livestock properly, and there's a lack of human resources. But what this reminds me of is what Arjuna told us earlier today, the situation in Maharashtra, which was solved in large part by getting everybody to sit around the table or the village tree or the holy cow or whatever it was in Maharashtra together in order to analyze the situation, to understand what needed to be done, and to agree on a game plan. And we know that in your part of West Africa, very often when it does work, it's when the farmers and the pastoralists, for example, figure out a way of managing exclosures for a certain period of time. So I think that you made a particularly crucial point, Malanding, when you said that a minimum of tree cover at various scales is going to be the metric that you will use as a proxy for the restoration of your landscapes. And moving over to you, Andreas, I mean, you're a specialist in monitoring these things and in trying to figure out how to design monitoring systems that do not have projects managing to the metric, but having projects managing to the outcome. How would you rate this idea of a minimum tree cover, and have you, in your experience, perhaps in other countries, encountered situations where people have done that or something else to try to achieve the same results that Malanding and his colleagues are trying to achieve in the Gambia?
Excellent, Patrick, excellent question, and Malanding, excellent presentation on the case in the country. Look, let me scale back before I go into answering this question, and just to give you a little bit of context. Coming from the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund, notably the largest climate fund in the world, one thing that we constantly think about is this question of, if we then have the investments in on the ground, how do we know what is happening, and how do we address the question of impacts and outcomes on the ground? And so as an evaluator, we asking ourselves two questions. The one question that we ask is, are we doing things right? So we're looking at efficiencies, we're looking at effectiveness, we're looking at the progress that we want in the projects on the ground. And that's good. But we usually only stopping there by saying, okay, that's the accountability function that we have. That's the metric, as you say, measuring to the metric that we have. So we started at the independent evaluation unit to look beyond this and answer the second question, which is, are we doing the right things? And here, as a GCF, as a fund, and as a vehicle and a financial vehicle of the UNFCCC, what we're thinking about then is, so what do we know globally? What can we say about nature-based solutions? And the way how we addressed this was by going ahead with what we call a global evidence review. So we looked at the evidence out there globally in the adaptation space, as an example, as well as the forest space. And we commissioned and done a global evidence review together with partners to look at exactly these questions. And what's interesting there is that the evidence gap maps would truly give you an idea of where is the information, where is the evidence out there currently, but also where are the gaps, and where are the gaps in our knowledge on what works for whom and how. And what we've done with this is, and just to highlight this very briefly, it allows us as a GCF to leapfrog from mistakes that have been done in other countries, to learn efficiently and effectively in moving forward and trying to identify the ways forward that, as the previous speakers have said, that include the question of innovation, the question of true country ownership, so truly speaking to the people on the ground, which would include the question of gender, the question of vulnerable groups in the rural areas in particular. But also thinking about something that's very dear to us, and that's traditional knowledge. We most often forget about these components of traditional knowledge. So what we have is a very pithy product, if I may say. So the evidence gap map in climate change adaptation looks at the climate change adaptation space from 2015 to now, given that, honestly, climate change adaptation is something that we've only started to discuss very recently. Before 2015, we couldn't find that many studies. And we basically did a two-dimensional metrics. You can, of course, do more, but we did it for 2 dimensions to look at the intervention side in the sectors. What do we know? What type of interventions are done? As well as at the outcome level, what types of outcomes are we usually after? And then populate this metrics with all the studies that we know and all the studies that we could find in the literature, in Web of Scopus and all those sorts, as well as in the grey literature, because it's important to have these practical and practitioners' reports as well. And what we found is truly interesting. And let me just highlight 2 things here. One is we found there is definitely an imbalance in terms of geographical distribution of information. So Africa and the sub-Saharan area have lots of amounts of lots of rich evidence on what works and how it works. However, Latin Americas and other areas in Africa have truly been under-researched, and we don't know how things are working. And then when we go over to the sectors and asking the question of what do we know in certain sectors, we truly find a rich evidence base for agriculture, for forestry, for fishery, traditional areas. But what we don't know is, we don't know enough on what works and how and for whom in the area of water. In the area of watershed, we've just heard a couple of really insightful projects here that in terms of watershed and how does it work and what sort of impacts we have. So these absolute gaps have really been very insightful for us in our own programming and our own move forward. And lastly, one thing that I wanted to highlight is the question of institutional outcomes as well. So we realized not only on the intervention level, but also on the outcome level, there are areas where we just have absolute gaps. So the question of enabling environments, how do we affect the policy space and the policy area, is something that has not been researched to the absolute level that we would like to see. And that brings me to a crucial problem that funds like the GCF as well as private sectors are often lacking. We are not at the point where we have enough information that would allow us to go into these areas, and we need to decide now if we want to follow the evidence-based areas, so the rich evidence areas, or if we want to go for something what requires thought leadership, and but also means that we go into areas where we have evidence scarcity, and where we truly have to look at piloting new methods and new innovations. And so all in all, there are institutional struggles. So as I said, the policy area is not really researched. We have also a couple of questions on how do we define innovation? What is the innovation that we truly need in nature-based solutions? How can we include traditional knowledge? So I'm not repeating myself too much, hopefully, but the last point that I want to make here is to say that one thing that we've realized is it's not always the case of technological innovation that we need, because the hardware innovations are there. It's the software innovations that are now necessary, where we truly think about how can we foster adoption, how can we create long-term sustainability. So these are some of these things that we are currently thinking of here at the Independent Evaluation Unit. And it's been really insightful to hear of this. So just to this question that you've been asking me, I hope this answered some of these questions there, to see how the GCF is thinking about these things and how we as evaluators are thinking and addressing these things. And it requires just more knowledge sharing, stronger evidence, and more collaboration on the ground to truly understand what matters.
Thank you, Andreas. What I found fascinating in there is the way that you were using artificial intelligence to do your gap analysis to try to understand what is happening and what is not happening. And I know, Nitin, that you have a boutique business using artificial intelligence for environmental and climate-related issues, and we'll come to that in a minute. But before we start dealing with chips and bytes, we have to deal with wetware, also known as brains, and people. And so I'd like now to bring a social scientist in, Serah Kiragu-Wissler, who is working on research projects for TMG in Kenya. Serah, all this highfalutin talk about innovations, about billions of dollars flowing here and there, about monitoring things, about using artificial intelligence to do God knows what, it reminds me of Elon Musk wanting to settle Mars. In real life, we've got farmers who are trying to better their lot and make sure that their kids have a better life. So how do we work with these farmers to translate this stuff that's happening in these rooms at COP to something that actually helps them in their everyday life?
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can
yes.
hear me. Thank you. I think Andreas has really set the stage for this discussion, because he has alluded to the issue of evidence, what works, and especially at the local level. What about innovations? Is it just about technological innovation? So I feel very honored to share the experiences of TMG when it comes to local level operations working with farmers. And I want to start by acknowledging that or reiterating that soils as a carbon storage are an important component of adaptation to climate change. And hence, any measures that go into protecting soils really are measures for adapting to climate change. And at the same time, given the context of Africa, where we have majority of people working on soils being farmers at the center and must be at the center of any discussions that regard working with soils and protecting soils. And hence, many of our experiences with regard to what works on the ground when it comes to implementation, but most importantly, when it comes to what does it mean to go to scale, both temporal and spatial, we have garnered good and interesting lessons that I can share with you. And what we have done basically is that TMG has worked in a couple of African countries, specifically Benin, Burkina Faso, and Kenya, where we have looked at what farmers need to be able to adapt or adopt soil protection measures at scale. Soil protection measures within spatial period, not just during the project implementation, but also in the long term, but also beyond the usual interventions by a project in terms of space. And I would want to highlight about 4 of these lessons of conditions or elements that constitute, enabling environment, enabling conditions to scaling. And one is the need for continuous advisory support. In the agricultural sector, they call it extension services. And what we have observed is that project-based support is normally very good at the beginning because it comes with momentum, a lot of resources. If it's an USAID funded project or a GIZ, a lot of support is provided in an area. But beyond the project period, there's not really much that continues. And the farmers were very articulate to say, we need this support continuously. And not just the farmers who were project beneficiaries, but those who are beyond, because a project does not normally reach everyone. And what we did is working with the farmers, and specifically the example of Benin, is that with the community, NGIZ, we were able to develop a social innovation that involves a farmer-led knowledge transfer of soil protection measures, what is commonly known as the TSG model or the Temgorado model. And this model involves one farmer who is trained taking a social responsibility within his community. Now, someone mentioned about the indigenous with the local knowledge. So the social capital, the social connectedness to train 3 other.
The transition is the real gap, Secretary General, that we need to close.
And the other 3 continue to train 3 other farmers, and this process continues. Another important element that became very clear is that land tenure is at the core of soil protection. So farmers cannot develop much interest in protecting soils if they have no security or tenure to the land that they are working on. Examples, very prominent ones, came from Burkina Faso, where women are forced to move, it's called the forced rotation. They clear their land this season, they plant, and next season they are not assured of being there. So what will motivate them to be carrying loads of manure, from the village to the fields, if they cannot be assured that it will be there for, 2, 3, 4 seasons? The same with Kenya, women and youth. As long as they do not have, secured access to the land, then they do not get much interest in taking on the soil protection measures. Again, here, what we did is to say we cannot ignore, we cannot stick to the technological, the hardware innovations. We have to think through what is possible, and we had to nurture homegrown solutions with the community and with the local actors. So in Burkina Faso, we had a process where there was mediation that enabled men or encouraged men to actually even sign contracts to say they are going to let their women stay on the same plot of land for longer than has been going on. And this was, accepted within the village and signed in village meetings. In Kenya, we nurtured a community-led land lease guidelines process where youth and women who would not access land before are now able to access land. And again, alluding to Andreas' mention to the institutional outcome, what came out is a community-led institution for managing how land is used at the community level. And I'm happy to say that this process has been recognized by the local governance, the Kakamega County in Western Kenya, and the government, that regional government, is in process of taking it on board to acknowledge it as a community-led institution that can be availed to other corners of the county. Another element worth noting here is the role of the civil society, particularly the locally based civil society institutions. What we did is to work closely with them because they really understand very well the local dynamics, the local governance regimes, and they are able to bridge between what is coming from the scientists or from the government and work it with the local community. They are able to bridge that knowledge and experience exchange. So again, very important, especially now that we had our colleague Namita talking about finance. Often these small scale organizations hardly get the resources they need to perform, yet they are such a critical node and connector, between the global, national, and the very local. So it is, in my view and in our view, it is important to work with these organizations as well as to even support by financing them. And lastly, for now, I would also take note of the fact that farmers need a strong voice in decision making, not just in the usual planning and implementation, but the level of decision making. What constitutes the EBA practices? What gets to constitute the soil protection measures that are then promoted? They need to be involved. And this came out very clearly in Kenya, where the technical staff from the ministry said, much as the farmers want extension services, we as the technocrats are unable to decide this because of the budget. But again, the farmers are the ones who also constitute the population that votes, which means they are able to guide their leaders. But if they don't have a strong platform to be able to voice this and to really guide the sector policies, then it does not work. And based on that, we were able to then link up with a farmer organization on the ground. And as I speak, they're in the process of organizing what has become popularly known as the Governors' Day with Farmers, where they set the agenda, where they run the show to show or to give views on how the sector should be managed. And I'm very happy to say that this event is taking place in February next year. The governor himself has acknowledged that indeed it is worth having this high level one-on-one discussion with the farmers, and is in the process of institutionalizing it and getting it accepted through a cabinet memo that a sitting governor should be able to sit with the farmers one-on-one and discuss. And one important thing is that actually the issue of poor soils have already ranked high in the concerns of the farmers. And this is part of what they'll be taking on the table. So maybe I stop it at that, but I can continue with the list.
Thank you, Serah. I love your passion, but I'm also delighted that you brought it back to the most important things that we found in Gambia, that we found in India, and that I'm sure, I know from personal experience, we also find in other countries around the world, including in Europe. For those of you who don't know, I'm also president of the European Agroforestry Federation. And that is that farmers always need the same 4 things broadly. They need expert advice, and they don't need advice on how to use a pesticide. They need advice on how to integrate trees, on how to restore their landscapes, continuous extension services. We need social innovations. We need lead farmers. We need women's groups. We need people from the community to innovate in the way that they will manage those landscapes, design the exclosures, figure out how to manage the community forests. tenure is extraordinarily important, and the more we go into West Africa, the more I know about tenure in West Africa, the more I'm speechless with admiration at the extraordinary complexity of the traditional tenure systems that operate in those landscapes, where you can have half a dozen different owners for different bits of a tree or of a plan or of a piece of land. Now, if that works, it works brilliantly. When it's damaged by colonialism, by modernity, and by other factors, it starts misbehaving, and dealing with that is absolutely crucial. And that leads to the fourth point that you mentioned, Serah, the homegrown solutions to institutional issues. I love the idea of men signing contracts with their women in Burkina Faso to ensure that the ladies are allowed to stay on the same piece of land and thus improve the fertility of that piece of land. And I would like to tell every single gentleman out there who is watching us today who has a piece of land, consider doing the same inside your own family. But last but not least, Nitin, you've operated on these issues at some of the most rarefied levels. You were director of World Resources Institute India. You're now, of course, managing the research arm of Ashoka. And you are applying artificial intelligence to figure out how to deal with these incentives, with the metrics that are needed, and thus to reassure the investors. Is any of the things that you've heard today, do they ring a bell of familiarity in what's happening in your own country?
Well, I guess thank you, Peter, for that, and to all the panelists, Patrick, and the panelists and the speakers before me. There's a little bit of time left, but I have the advantage that a lot has been said already. I think the way we're sort of looking at this in India is to try and look at, what are the different roles of the different stakeholders that they have to play, and how does it come together so that not only does it give assurance to the investor, which is critical, but it gives assurance to the ultimate off-taker, which is the farmer. And so I think it's okay to create large pots of money, but at the same time, if you have to take uptake of that money, then in that case, there must be a demand for that color of money that's out there, which means that the money must be able to fund the kind of things that, as Serah was saying, that people on the ground have been involved in deciding what it is that they need to do with it. And that engagement is key. So we've sort of taken a slightly different approach to this. In fact, based on the work that our partners in ICRAF have worked with us in our program in ARREST, is to look at and try to understand the demand side a lot more. The demand side of finance itself a lot more, which means that we have to understand the end user and the customer. Because if we are able to identify those needs correctly, then my suspicion is that there will be uptake, there'll be a demand for the requisite finance, and there'll be an uptake of that finance. So we're looking at it very much from the end user perspective, and we feel that by creating that kind of finance, we'll be able to scale it because it'll have the inherent characteristic that it actually represents the needs and the requirements of the end users. So given that, maybe what I can do is I can just sort of quickly run through one mechanism that we've used. So let me see if I can pull this up. Yeah. So one of the things that we've looked at, in fact, Kai Mausch at ICRAF did all that wonderful work to identify what are the aspirations of people on the ground, including farmers. And in fact, you find that only a small percentage of the work that they do and their entire revenue stream actually comes from farming. The world is changing. The question is, how does one add value so that it leads to adaptation and restoration of the land that they have, to use that and to add value to it, and at the same time increase their income? And that's where I feel a lot of innovation is required. So we took several approaches to this. One of the approaches was that we started prioritizing jobs. There is a fair amount of service economy out there. People are looking for employment. And then how could we actually scale adaptation and sequestration in a manner that can actually create a large number of jobs? And in fact, in peninsular India, we found that we could generate over 400 million man-days of employment for over 4 million households up to 2027 across several districts in India. Now, that's using many techniques in which the farmer is engaged in making the decisions, whether it's agroforestry or ANR or conservation or community-centric efforts or management of invasive species. Let's focus in on just one of them for a second. We have a program which talks about managing invasive species, starting from removal, all the way to crafts, all the way to including them in building materials, all the way to including them in making plywood kinds of boards and so on. And that gives the ability for entrepreneurs to enter the sector who can be financed. And again, that meets the need that you can actually provide for value addition for the farmers to even have the incentive or the inclination to create the demand for the finance that is required. We've identified 13 million hectares of land just outside the protected areas in peninsular India, with 100 million households over there. And this program, working with ICRAF, the Environmental Defense Fund, Columbia University, and also Foundation for Ecological Security, has created those data sets that actually provide the information to the financier so that they know that there is an upside in this, because there is a scale that we're already planning in from day one, and where the scaling is by looking at scaling of the demand. And finally, this is what you get when you actually have artisans and wonderful things that you can create by adding value. These are actual, each of these elephants is actually an elephant from the Bilirangan Hills area that we work in. It's a specific elephant. And this is made out of lantana, an invasive, which we manage. And the artisans have created this at a very high cost, which is sold. And the elephant family has helped us put this right here, outside of local Buckingham Palace. So the type of value addition that we can do by using the resources available must add that kind of value so that there is an incentive for people to actually be engaged in adaptation and therefore demand the kind of finance that is needed to support that kind of work. And I think I'll stop there.
Nitin, thank you very much. I love the idea of these elephants representing, symbolizing what is happening when you're managing demand. And this reminds me of an experience I had in Indonesia many years ago of seeing villages that had followed a similar trajectory and that had achieved a good livelihood by specializing in the production of wooden Harley-Davidson motorcycles in all sizes, from key rings to full-size models. It worked. What was particularly interesting there as well is that they were using an invasive tree species to do so, so they were adding value to something. So it seems sometimes that the good ideas are just struggling to be recognized rather than struggling to be implemented because they're already happening in the landscape. Now, before we move on, we have Jessica Troni, who is going to be our concluding speaker, but we will have time for Q&As. I'm glad to be able to report that you will be my prisoners for a little while longer, because the next session is only at 6 o'clock. And I'm also glad to report that the guiding light for these efforts at ICRAF, Dr. Lalisa Duguma, who we saw in a video early on, has now managed to connect and is now available. So Lalisa, I hope you managed to hear most of what was said here. And I invite you to come in and to perhaps link what you heard from Andreas, Malanding, Serah, and Nitin from your perspective of standardizing the adaptation-based monitoring systems. Lalisa, if you're there, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. This is really fantastic moderation, and I think the connections are really working quite well, except for me. But I managed to get in at least, but I was listening through the YouTube channel. I think when we think about adaptation, one thing that always need to be at the forefront is how do we nudge people's behavior so that it is nature positive and also it is yielding the right ecosystem goods and services. So in a way, it helps us to adapt with the current situation and also helps us to the anticipated changes that we might face in the near future. Getting there is not an easy task. It's a heavy process. I mean, it's an intensive process that requires quite a lot of engagement. And one of the key things that was raised is the fact that we have a lot of practices that Andreas mentioned are really working in African context. I'm just focusing on the African context for a little while. This is really interesting because we often think we don't have those practices or we don't know those practices, but this again links with the fact that there is a lot of local ecological knowledge or traditional practices that we need to bring into the picture if we want to move forward with these adaptation outcomes at a larger scale. Of course, the issue of finance, without the finance, there is nothing that can be done. But let's also think about innovative financing mechanisms, not only through the project granting mechanisms or through the funding proposal mechanisms, but also attracting enterprise options into the adaptation space. That's why I love the EBA concept, because through the mitigation options that you have within the ecosystems, because in the ecosystems you have the carbon element coming broadly as a major one, while you also gain the adaptation benefits. We can actually bring in a kind of nudged red plus kind of situation into this space. And that could be an attractive way of pulling in private investors into this space. Because in my few points that I raised, one of the key issues I raised is about the financing gap. Yes, that is there, but we need to be innovative if we have to get there, which is also mentioned by one of the speakers. Quite strikingly, I mean, we have not heard so much about the extension services, but Serah brought it up very nicely, including the tenure issues. I think these are really critical enablers for us if we have to do it within the space that people have from a land holding size perspective. That does not mean we should only focus on the farming system space, but we should also go beyond that. The protected areas could also be one area where we have a lot of investment to make to enhance adaptation outcomes. The main thing there with the advisory services is very often who is giving that advisory service to the people. If you go down to the village level, you see one person who is advising on forestry, on livestock, on so many aspects, as if they are made to be a package. That needs to be improved if we have to make it right, because we are looking at this point, something that really yields much better than one sectoral action plan or investment portfolio. And I think the policy aspect is also very critical, which is also highlighted. The policy aspect in this sense is the tenure issue and also the monitoring aspect, also the infrastructure aspect. These are quite critical things, which we broadly can call them enablers. So in a nutshell, I think we have gotten quite a lot of points that we need to be looking at. It's not just about the practices, it is also about the processes, it's also about the policy, it is also about the people. And there are so many P's involved in this adaptation agenda. Thank you so much.
You'd be delighted to hear that I spent the morning with a bunch of carbon fund people, blockchain techies, bankers, and the key message that came out there is that while a lot of money is flowing into carbon, integrity of that money was becoming ever more important. And integrity means, for example, moving away from the plantation of fast-growing trees and moving into the plantation of a range of biodiverse trees. It means openings for things that we know are important, for example, participatory domestication, the art of teaching villagers how to domesticate their own favorite trees so that you don't depend on external seeds with all of the adaptation and disease risks that they bring, but so that you can grow your own local seeds. So it was encouraged to hear that people who are coming from a very different environment, from the financial environment, the tech environment, were beginning to take these issues seriously and realizing that these biotic issues were as important as the abiotic issues they spent their lives worrying about. Jessica Troni, who's going to give us the final remarks, will, I'm sure, have a lot to say about this. But before I introduce her, I just want to tell you in the audience that please use the tools that you have to send us questions. The panel will have the questions in big red letters on a giant screen, and so we will be able to understand them and we will be able to debate them. So fire away, no question will remain unanswered, I promise. Jessica, you are the chief of the Climate Change Adaptation Unit at UNEP. You have over 25 years experience in environment and development policy and have worked over 14 years at the UN on climate change adaptation programming. You're based in Nairobi and you oversee the UNEP's adaptation portfolio there. You were the regional technical advisor for adaptation for East and Southern Africa between 2007 and 2048, and for the UK Department for International Development before that. Jessica, you've heard what farmers need, what bankers need, what artificial intelligence geeks need. What do you need as the head of a global climate change adaptation effort?
Thank you very much. And yeah, I have the enviable or maybe unenviable task of summing up everything that's been said, and it has been a rich discussion. So yes, I work for UNEP. We were set up in 1972. We're coming up to our 50 years to be the environmental voice in the UN system. And we've been working very closely with ICRAF on GCF projects. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to give the final words. I just want to really pick up on the issue of scaling up because project development is very, very slow. To access GCF funding from the start of a concept idea to actually getting the project approved through board can take you 5 years. I mean, there is just no way that we can get the funding to the countries through the project vehicle. It's just impossible. You can't do it. So I really want to touch on this idea of mainstreaming into domestic plans and budgets as a means of scaling up. And in that idea, I want to pick up on the ideas that have been and the assertions that have been made by the participants on project continuity being an issue, system perspectives being absolutely necessary if we want to create impact, and importantly, to avoid maladaptation. I want to pick up on the idea of needing to be evidence-based and needing to generate that evidence in a collaborative manner. And I want to pick up on the really real constraint
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we seem to have lost Jessica, but in the hope that she comes back very soon, I'm sure I speak for all of us on the panel when we sympathize. Project approval processes are... Oh, she's back. Jessica, go for it.
Sorry, the connection has been very, very unstable. So I wanted to pick up on the very real issue of capacities. For some countries, it's a huge, huge issue. So what are my points? My points are that there is no point in having an adaptation project if the Ministry of Agriculture believes and places value on land clearing and planting of monocultures. You're right there, you're up against a huge perverse incentive towards ecosystem-based adaptation. So you have to deal with that. You have to build dialogue processes. You have to build co-generation of the evidence base. You have to look for those win-wins in order to be able to change the way that certain line ministries plan. You need to ask, are all the targets in performance plans that governments have, are they all building resilience or are they undermining resilience? How up to date are knowledge and capacities? And it's not just the Ministry of Environment, of course, it's really, you're talking about the line ministries and the budgets that they have. You need to strengthen systems thinking. You need to mainstream into the National Development Plan. And I don't mean simply a chapter on climate change that's tacked on the end. That's not mainstreaming. Mainstreaming has to mean that every single chapter in your National Development Plan is geared towards building resilience to adaptation. I would put it to you that if you do that, you can then create budget support mechanisms that are able to absorb larger investment flows. And not only that, you can lower the risk in an economy and you can attract impact financing. Because at the moment, in our experience, there is a lot of interest in impact financing, a lot of private sector interest, but the interest rates, the returns that they want are still too high. So there is a disconnect between what is possible on the private sector side and what the financing needs are at the country level. So I just want to leave with those thoughts. Those are the thoughts from my experience in working in this area for many, many years. And I hope that brings together the various strands of discussion that we've had tonight. Thank you very much.
Jessica, that was marvelous. It did much more than bringing these together. It spoke from all of our hearts. Each and every one of us on this panel understands that we need to embed ecosystem adaptation, just like we need to embed mitigation in the way the economy works, in the way government works, in the way that everything works. And I can tell you stories about ministries of agriculture in Europe, in the US, in India, in Africa, in Asia, plowing a road to hell, a road to perdition, a road to destruction, right next door to a Ministry of Environment that is usually powerless and that keeps on raises their hands and say, guys, you're not going to paradise there, you're doing a bad thing, and being roundly ignored. And I know that at ICRAF and amongst many of the conversations we've had here at COP, many people are profoundly, deeply aware of this and have been deeply aware of this, not for years, not for decades. So the question becomes, why is it so hard for governments to embed these issues across their line ministries? And we have one representative of government here, so I'm going to land the hot potato in your lap, Malanding. If you look at Gambia, the example of your home country, I am sure that you recognize a lot of what Jessica says. Ministries often operate at cross purposes to one another. So looking at the example of the Gambia, why is it so difficult? I mean, the Gambia is not, it's not Russia, it's not a giant country, it's a small country. It's a country in which most people know each other. So why, even in that environment, which is theoretically conducive to better collaboration, do we find the prevalence of this silo thinking and this working at cross purposes?
Good question. But I think over the years, my observation is that it is really a matter of short-term gains and long-term gains. I mean, quite often when Ministry of Environment talk about issues, it's often about the long term. And that often does not do well when you have, the finance ministry trying to deliver on the budget now, or often the business.
Let me interrupt you right there and push back.
Yep.
And the reason I want to push back is governments do think in the long term. When they're building a motorway, they don't expect the revenue to come in this year. They expect the revenue over 20 years. Same when they build a power plant, same when they build a hospital. People are used to invest today in order to accrue benefits over the long period of time. Yes. So why don't they use the same thinking when it comes to ecosystem-based adaptation measures?
Well, again, it's about, some of the immediate needs today that often drive these very destructive, extractive patterns. For in the Gambia's case, for instance, one of the major hurdles of really managing our ecosystems is the extraction of wood for firewood and charcoal. This consumes almost 50 to 60% of all wood we extract from the forest. An easy solution would be, let's find an alternative. But the first thing they say, we don't have enough money. The budgets would not be able to support alternatives such as LPG. And then we start working on planting trees today, but before we know it, a truckload is out the following evening. And the little trees you have now will take 20 years before they can even become close enough to what has been extracted. So yes, there are these competing interests, and often it is the business interests against the environmental interests that tend to have. And the politicians everywhere, are friends to environments when the votes are around, but are very good friends to the business when they need the economy to move or they need to solve some of their basic needs. And there is always going to be that back and push and pull. But I think for the long term and for what we are doing, we are trying to make it very easy for it to be clear that it is in everyone's interest to make sure that certain actions are in place. Recently, for instance, we have this issue of coastline that is sand mining, coastal sand mining, so that we can put buildings up, which is important. But when you do that, you end up having what? Minefields or wasteland of big, potentially nice beaches, but at the same time you destroy it so much. So essentially what we have to do is to find a way of introducing the idea of compact earth, soil bricks that use quarry waste, away from the beaches. And it's taking us a lot of time and effort to make it, to demonstrate to both the public as well as some members of the government that this is the future. If we want to be sustainable, we want to really bring back some of our ecosystems. We don't have to destroy the ones that are most valuable right now.
Is the issue perhaps like in the UK? There was a story in The Economist last week explaining that the UK was hampered in executing its climate change efforts because the finance ministry did not see it as its mission to use the tax system to influence behavior, but simply as its mission to use the tax system to extract revenue and to distribute it as little as possible to line ministries, which explains apparently why in the UK the efforts to convince people to move from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles is using a complicated incentive system rather than the extremely simple and straightforward carbon tax. Do you recognize a similar sort of thing happening in the Gambia, where your finance ministry is simply unable to tax deleterious behavior in order to reward good behavior?
Oh yeah, especially, smaller governments are even more vulnerable. The Gambia is even more vulnerable to public pressure when it comes to financial mechanisms, because the moment the country is already burdened and almost everything is really tax-based. So any slight increase in taxes could mean even further problems. And the poverty levels are so high that any amount of tax you really add on, you are just increasing more burden. So essentially, governments are often, even against their own interests, saying no to some of these things. And that's why we have the extraction of the resources being the one that really come out, because it is so easy to say, well, they will recover. Yes, it's hard to get the money and square the deal, but natural resource, you can always push it off.
Right.
And I think that is where we have a...
That may be a problem in a small country, but Nitin, you come from a large country. In fact, the world's most populous country, I believe, today. So you're at the opposite extreme. Do you recognize that? Is the mechanism similar? So is it scale invariant, or are other things happening when you're trying to break silos at the level of an entity as large as the Indian Federation?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. That's all, it's really as simple as that. There are efforts that are going on. I think the government does recognize the problem there inherent in that. In fact, the government recently launched something called the Ministry of Cooperation, which would help in trying to overcome some of these issues. There are going to be all kinds of bottlenecks, but the problem is well recognized. And because if you take any issue, you're going to have more than 2 or 3 ministries, a couple of states, and so on, who are going to be involved in a country as large as India. I don't think there's a silver bullet answer to this. I think it...
I think we need to wrap up, so I'm afraid I'm going to interrupt you and pick up on that image of yours. There is no silver bullet to these issues. There is no magic bullet to these issues, but there is a magic pizza pie. There is a magic pie with lots of slices, and each of these individual slices can contribute something to the solution. And perhaps that is, Andreas, what you should take home tonight from the conversations we've had. You already mandated to analyze how to do this at a global level, how to help countries learn from one another on opposite sides of the world, and maybe you should change the logo, therefore, of the Green Climate Fund to that of a giant pizza. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope you found this session as fascinating and interesting as I did. May I ask you to virtually give a warm round of applause to our speakers and our panelists. I will channel them myself.